Hi, my name is Alex West, and I'm Director of Research for Ann Arbor Spark. A big focus for my role, and for Spark in general, is benchmarking the Ann Arbor region. How do we stack up against similar regions around the US? We've all heard stories comparing our region to others, but is there data to back up the general hypotheses? The first benchmarking study was published in 2017, with input from our executive committee and CEO roundtable groups to choose the regions and the metrics. Spark published an update to this report in 2018, and the report I'm about to present is the third iteration. It's helpful to track our performance on certain metrics over time, as well as adapt and add different metrics as things change. Also, all of the data I'm about to present is from before the pandemic. It's useful to examine where we were, to understand where we are now, and where we want to be in the future. All right, who are we benchmarking ourselves against? Many of the selected regions were chosen due to their inclusion in anecdotal comparisons to the Ann Arbor region. Austin, Texas is a perfect example. There are many similarities to Ann Arbor, but when comparing available services and city policy, it's helpful to remember that Austin is 8 times larger than Ann Arbor. So, where possible, the data have been normalized for population. Most metrics are compared at the county level, some at the city level, and some at the metropolitan statistical area level. Metrics. What metrics are we using to compare regions? Those regions that I just mentioned are ranked on each of these 8 metrics. I will explain how they are measured one by one later in the presentation. Briefly, these are the key findings from the 2020 report, or the rankings for Ann Arbor, Washtenaw County on each of these metrics and how they've changed over time. You can see quickly that most of the rankings either stayed the same or improved since the last report. Again, this data is pre-pandemic. The report itself is designed as a PDF available on our website. I've kept the general formatting and structure for this presentation. We have the Ann Arbor region's ranking, the level for that metric, the 1-year trend, and the top 5 average. I will also discuss what the metric measures, why it matters, and the top headline for Washtenaw County for each metric. All right, let's get to it. I'll discuss each metric in order of the ranking of the Ann Arbor region from highest to lowest, beginning with university R&D expenditure. What is it? This is the amount that each university spends on research and development. Much of this funding comes directly from the federal government and other grant sources, as well as university sources. It matters because university R&D expenditures provide opportunities for risk-taking, proving ideas, and adding to the innovation pipeline. R&D funding helps to build a conduit of research for future innovations. The University of Michigan is ranked #1 against the competitive set in this metric, with R&D expenditures at over $1.5 billion. Nationally, the University of Michigan is ranked #2 for research spending, right behind Johns Hopkins. Since the last report, there hasn't been a significant change in ranking amongst our competitive set. This is expected. The University of Michigan is a world-class institution with well-funded, nationally recognized research complex. The US trend for university R&D expenditure is increasing dramatically, but there's a question to consider as a result of COVID-19. What happens to the money, as most of it comes from federal sources, in the context of a recession? Next up is population movement. These are period estimates that measure where people lived when surveyed, so their current residents, and where they lived 1 year prior, so 1 year ago. The data are collected continuously over a 5-year period, in this case, 2013 to 2017. The flow estimates resemble the annual number of movers between counties for a 5-year period. This matters because to be considered an innovation hub, the Ann Arbor region must be attractive to outside talent. Net population movement, both inter- and intrastate, can potentially indicate the attractiveness of a region to outside talent, especially when viewed as proportional to population. Since the last report, Washtenaw County has moved up in the rankings from 5th to 3rd. This is a significant jump in ranking for net migration. Washtenaw County is still the most popular destination for movers within Michigan, and according to this data, Washtenaw County is no longer losing people out of state. We are gaining more than we are losing. This is a notable change from the previous report. next metric is the share of remote jobs. This is the percentage of the jobs in a metropolitan statistical area that can be performed at home. This is based on research from the University of Chicago Booth School of Business, and according to this research, 37% of US jobs can plausibly be performed at home, accounting for 46% of all wages. It matters because this ranking indicates a readiness to shift to remote work, which in the context of a pandemic recession may indicate resilience of an economy. The communities ranked highest on this metric are regarded as tech hubs, like Boulder, Austin, and San Francisco. Note that the geography for this metric is different than all other metrics. The metropolitan statistical area that encompasses Ann Arbor is known as the Ann Arbor MSA and has identical boundaries to Washtenaw County. However, the boundaries of the other MSAs are sometimes much bigger, including multiple counties and cities. This is a new metric due to the COVID-19 pandemic, and our high ranking here implies that a lot of existing jobs within Washtenaw County are tech-based and easily done from home, which is in line with the increasing number of tech-based jobs in Washtenaw County's economy over time. However, the impacts on the people-facing businesses, restaurants, transportation, and retail, etc., that had grown significantly since the last recession are significant and severe. The implications of this metric are still being played out by the pandemic. Some companies in costly cities, like San Francisco, are allowing all employees to work remotely indefinitely and recruiting people from all over the world. For a market like Ann Arbor, the final consequences remain to be seen. Due to our high ranking, the worst effects of COVID-19 on the Washtenaw County economy may be muted for a larger share of the population. However, this share is not equally distributed by industry, race, or socioeconomic status. This is something we will discuss in greater detail later in the presentation. Next up is venture capital activity. This is the regional concentration of venture capital deals, normalized for population. The location quotient measures a region's performance relative to the nation. 1 means the region and the nation are equally specialized. Anything above 1 indicates the region has a higher concentration than the nation. This particular metric measures venture capital deal count concentration, as opposed to deal value. This matters because high levels of venture capital activity indicate areas of innovation. Venture capital is important for the growth of startups, as venture investors tolerate more risk than conventional investors and lending institutions. Regions like Silicon Valley, New York City, and Boston often get more national attention for large venture capital activity, but smaller regions often have higher than average levels of activity when normalized for population. Since the last report, Ann Arbor has moved up 1 spot in the rankings, to 3rd from 4th. Berkeley and Boulder's levels of VC activity continue to skyrocket. In this analysis, they are almost outliers, requiring a much larger range and rendering the differences between the rest of the pack nearly indistinguishable. As a result of controlling for population, Ann Arbor continues to rise above the rest. Next up, we'll look at housing affordability, which is a ratio measuring affordability by dividing the median home price by the median income. A ratio of 3.9 means that median home prices are 3.9 times the median income. This matters because housing cost is a key factor influencing quality of life, which affects a region's ability to attract and retain talent. Housing affordability is also a measure of inequality and access to opportunity. If the ratio is high, it can indicate a highly segregated real estate market and a high level of income inequality. Conversely, it is also an indicator of attractiveness of a housing market. Since our last report, despite housing prices going up, the Ann Arbor area moved up 5 spots in rankings for housing affordability from 9th to 4th. There is a perception of Washtenaw County as an expensive housing market. This is borne out in the data when comparing to Midwestern and Rust Belt cities. However, when comparing to Austin, Berkeley, Boulder, and Portland, Ann Arbor is relatively cheap. The overall trend in the competitive set is toward a more expensive housing market, and this is not unique to Washtenaw County. Still, Washtenaw County is decidedly less affordable within Michigan. The big takeaway here is to know your audience. Next, we'll talk about the percent of the population in poverty and ALICE. So this is the percentage of the population in each county that lives at or below the poverty line, or within the asset-limited, income-constrained employed group, or ALICE, outlined by United Way. This group contains households that earn above the federal poverty level, but not enough to afford a bare-bones household budget. It matters because a growing body of research shows strong links among inequality, poverty, and opportunity. For example, of the factors most cited as driving poverty in America, education, family structure, race, and more, the number one factor by far is the growth in inequality. There is a significant negative relationship between living in an area with greater income inequality and a child's expected upward mobility. Therefore, it can be an illuminating metric to track the accessibility of economic opportunity. Many of the regions most associated with the tech boom are also the most unequal. Including ALICE percentages along with the poverty highlights segments of the population that are often overlooked when it comes to policy solutions. Here, Washtenaw County is in the middle of the pack, barely outperforming some of our competitive set. So this is a new metric, which is previously termed income inequality in other reports and measured using the Gini coefficient. We were ranked 13th on this metric in 2018. So this is a new way of measuring this. Paired with other metrics like housing affordability and unemployment, it paints a significantly different picture of our competitive set. Including it in the report is necessary to understand that while many of these regions are listed on Best Places list and touted as high-growth technology economies, these benefits are not enjoyed by everyone. There is a tendency to overlook large segments of the population whose financial position prevents them from accessing basic opportunities and building wealth. In the context of a pandemic recession, these disparities will grow. The future success of these communities is directly tied to the financial stability of fragile households. Next up is driving industry employment. This is the percentage of the total employed population of a region employed in specific driving industries, which we define using NAICS codes. It matters because economies grow and prosper by their ability to make products and deliver services to people and businesses outside their geographic regions, by exporting. Driving industry jobs create and support jobs in other local industries and propel economic growth. Within this competitive set, driving industry employment is much higher than the national average, indicating a potential area for policy focus. Since our last report, Washtenaw County has dropped from 7th to 9th place. There are possible data issues this year as data.census.gov launched with new search functionality. Some things improved, others didn't. The NAICS codes included in this analysis do not include government, which is how many of the University of Michigan jobs are coded, and healthcare. These are the two largest employment groups in Ann Arbor by far. It's important to note that Hennepin County in Minneapolis is home to many Fortune 500 headquarters with lots of employees. It may be worth examining which industries make up the bulk of this employment and whether the driving industry is a key component of that or not. A key thing to note with this metric is that it can be volatile and dynamic since it relies on two changing numbers. Communities whose total employed populations are stagnating or even declining might perform better simply because the denominator isn't growing. Example, Washtenaw's employed population went up 3%, as did our number of driving industry jobs. Allegheny County's total employed population dropped slightly, but their number of driving industry jobs went up 5%, so their overall level of driving industry employment is higher. Next up is the labor market. This is a combination of the national unemployment rate, reflecting the number of unemployed people as a percentage of the labor force, and the labor force participation rate, measuring the number of people in the labor force as a percentage of the civilian, non-institutionalized population 16 years old and over. In other words, it's the percentage of the population either working or actively seeking work. The picture of the labor market is incomplete without both. It matters because before the pandemic, the unemployment rate was steadily decreasing everywhere, and labor force participation had finally started to increase, barely. However, the labor market was tight across the competitive set, with some regions reporting unemployment near 2%. In the context of a recession, this becomes the baseline that all regions are trying to get back to. Pre-pandemic, Washtenaw County enjoyed positive job growth and a steady decline in unemployment, with a slow increase in the participation rate. Since our last report, Washtenaw County has stayed steady in the rankings for unemployment, but has risen in the rankings for labor force participation. Before the COVID-19 pandemic, the unemployment rate in Washtenaw County was low and falling, but we remained steady in the unemployment rankings because labor was tighter in other places, so unemployment fell further in other places than in Washtenaw. In addition, in order to provide some labor, it appeared that more people were rejoining the labor force, meaning the labor force participation rate was trending upward. In the context of a recession, the unemployment rate is increasing rapidly, while the participation rate is dropping. There are now more questions than answers. How long will these trends continue? What does recovery look like? Our next section is titled Benchmarking the Gaps. The concept and practice of equity matters more than ever for economic development work. For our final portion, we ask ourselves, do the benefits apply to all? Aggregate statistics are sometimes useful, but they tend to hide disparities in opportunity. Many of our competitor regions were chosen because they appear in the same best of lists as Ann Arbor. Minneapolis, for example, often shows up as one of the best, most affordable cities to live in America. However, it is evident, given the events of the summer of 2020 and long before, that these benefits do not apply to all. In this section, we attempt to tease out some of the racial differences in the metrics presented and let the data speak for itself. Not every metric is feasibly split, so we focus specifically on poverty rate, housing affordability, and unemployment. This subject is delicate. To highlight the gaps present, we focus specifically on the differences between Black and African American residents and white residents of the chosen regions, using the terminology of the census. Instead of benchmarking the raw levels of each metric, we benchmark the gaps between those two groups. The wider the gap, the lower the ranking. You can't manage what you don't measure. Before we get into the data, I should set the context in terms of population. In 2018, 13% of the US population identified as Black or African American. Looking at our competitive set, some regions exceed the national average, while others, like Boulder, are excluded from these comparisons because of a lack of data to compare. Getting right into it, looking at the gap of the percent of the population in poverty. This is the difference between the percentage of the Black or African American population and the percentage of the white population in each county that lives at or below the poverty line. In every single county chosen, that difference is positive. It matters because in each region, a larger percentage of the Black or African American population experiences poverty than the white population. Any policy aimed at reducing poverty should consider the systemic drivers of this gap. Notably absent from this evaluation are Boulder, Colorado, and Bloomington, Indiana, whose Black populations are too small, and there's no data present in the census at that level. The percentage of Black households in Washtenaw County in poverty is 12.7% higher than white households. The effects of poverty are clearly borne more by one group than another. The second gap we'll examine is the gap in housing affordability. This is the difference between the housing affordability ratio for the white population and the Black or African American population. This ratio measures affordability by dividing the median home price, which is the same for both groups, by the median income, which differs widely between groups. And it matters because buying a home is one of the stepping stones toward building wealth. Poverty rate and housing affordability highlight some of the major generators of the racial wealth gap. The differences highlighted here illustrate a high level of income inequality across the board. In every county in our competitive set, income inequality makes housing less affordable for Black people, regardless of home price. In Washtenaw County, house prices are 3.7 times the median income for the white population and 7 times the median income for the Black population. The final gap we'll explore is the gap in unemployment. This is the national unemployment rate reflecting the number of unemployed people as a percentage of the labor force. This metric reflects the difference between the white population unemployment rate and the Black or African American unemployment rate in each county. It matters because unemployment is often discussed in the aggregate, lumping everyone in a region together. Policy decisions are made from these aggregations, perhaps leaving some people behind. Again, this data is pre-pandemic, indicating economic recovery rather than recession. Again, notably absent from this evaluation are Boulder and Bloomington, whose Black populations are too small, and there's no data present in the census at that level. Black unemployment in Washtenaw County is 2.9% higher than white unemployment. Even pre-pandemic, when all counties in the competitive set were enjoying positive job growth and a steady decline in unemployment, the Black segments of the population experienced unemployment at a higher rate than the average for every region except Portland, Oregon. In conclusion, pre-pandemic, Washtenaw County had finally begun to import more people from out of state than it was losing. Though housing prices were increasing, the county managed to remain competitive relative to the chosen group, and expensive within Michigan. The region was experiencing a persistent decline in unemployment, finally accompanied by a rise in labor force participation, and the university continued to invest heavily in research and development. However, these benefits were not enjoyed equally by all. In the context of a pandemic recession, benchmarking based on older data might seem fruitless. On the contrary, if the goal is to make real progress in a recovery, it's important to know the baseline, along with all of its flaws. Some of the issues brought to head in the current recession were present beforehand, and our recovery efforts should strive to include everyone.